Good afternoon. I'm Shannon Derejo from Creamer Media. Welcome to today's webinar on the automotive industry, where a panel of industry experts will discuss how the auto industry can build on South Africa's success while facing the challenges of the future. Today's webinar is sponsored by the Automotive Industry Development Centre, CHEP, Kucher Development Corporation, and Richards Bay Industrial Development Zone. We thank them for making this event possible. Before we begin, please be aware that we have enabled the Q&A function, so please post any questions into the Q&A box. You'll find this on the panel at the bottom of your screen. The facilitator will pick out themes in the questions and answer as many of them as possible throughout the discussion. To encourage interaction, we've also enabled the chat function, so you can network with the panelists via the chat box. You'll also find this at the bottom of your screen. Please remember not to post questions in the chat box, though, as we may miss them. You can post those into the Q&A. Please be aware that we are recording this webinar and we'll be sending the recording to you when it's available. We're also streaming the webinar live to YouTube and we'll share the link in the chat shortly. Today's webinar will be facilitated by Vinesh Maharaj, a director within the Operations Transformation Department of PwC South Africa. He's been working with clients in the energy, utilities, resources, automotive, and industrial manufacturing industries since 1995. He's also the South African leader of the Smart Manufacturing practice. His experience covers a wide range of areas, with specific expertise being obtained in industrial automation and control, manufacturing strategy, and IT/OT integration. Vinesh will facilitate the discussion with our panel, which consists of Renee Mutilal, Executive Director of the National Association of Automotive Components and Allied Manufacturers, Andile Africa, the CEO of the Automotive Industry Development Centre, Justin Barnes, Manufacturing Ambassador for the Toyota Vessels Institute for Manufacturing Studies, and Tandile Jack, Project Development and Business Development Manager at Kucher Development Corporation. I'll hand over now to our facilitator, Vinesh Maharaj, to take the proceedings forward. Over to you, Vinesh.
Good afternoon, Shannon, and good afternoon to our panelists and our audience out there. It's indeed an honor to be facilitating such an esteemed panel. And without further ado, let's get into the discussion. So, Renee, South Africa's automotive sector has been such a success story, right? In my opinion, it's almost recession-proof. So in your opinion, what has been the recipe for such success in this sector?
Yeah, afternoon, Vinesh, Shannon, my fellow panelists, and all of those who've kind of tuned in to watch us this afternoon. I think a really interesting question you asked, Vinesh, especially with some of the milestones we've seen happening this year. Just a couple of weeks ago, it was BMW that turned 65, I believe. Ford maybe close to already 100 in South Africa, maybe at the end of this year. Anyway, I think the point behind that is, we've got a really long established history of autos production in the country. We've got a really sophisticated network, both from an OEM perspective and the supplier base that has developed over a very long period of time. Importantly, and supporting that strong private sector presence, there's been a recognition and active involvement by various administrations of the South African government to provide levels of serious policy and incentive support. So we've got a fairly stable supporting mechanism here in South Africa. And I think that's an important point. We should recognize the role that various iterations of government policy have played in, I suppose, to some extent, maintaining and growing at different times parts of the autos value chain. So that stability is really important. I think we also underestimate how technologically diverse the production base in South Africa. I mean, the fact that you've got the really strong multinational presence across the supplier base, also really important. Another key point, I think, is well-established industry structures. If I think of, for example, the bodies and associations involved in supporting autos development. My own organization, one of them, similar in the OEM space, a well-organized labor environment. And in as much as at times we have really, I would say, robust engagements as a sector, there's a time and place for that. But that deep establishment and mode of cooperation has served the sector well, in my opinion. And I think there's a lot that we could probably talk to, but I may just close my opening comments on a very strong. There's always space for improvement, right? But we've got a really strong base of infrastructure support, the location advantages that we have, and I know there's colleagues on the call from various automotive hubs will probably talk a bit more to that. So the dedicated maintenance of an industrial policy, the kind of the trade policies that we have. Let's not forget that one. Favorable export environment, trade policies, whether it's the EU free trade agreement, the really topical one right now, obviously AGOA, and we're pushing really hard to ensure that South Africa maintains its place and long-term participation in AGOA. So yeah, I think that for me, Vinesh, is probably the initial starting point of why the sector's kind of been a mainstay of our manufacturing economy for some time now.
Thank you, Rene. Yeah, I think we've seen some big investments recently, like by Ford, and now BMW has also announced a big investment in hybrid vehicles. But policy support is really key to maintain, to keep this going. And I think we can learn lessons from Australia. I think with Australia not having sufficient automotive policy support, they lost most of the automotive industry. So on that note, maybe we can ask Justin, historically, what were the key elements of policy framework that enables South Africa to build an effective export-orientated automotive sector? Justin.
Good afternoon, everybody. The South African automotive industry shifted quite soon after the advent of democracy towards an export-oriented program called the Motor Industry Development Program, which introduced a set of rebates for exporting. So essentially, firms could offset their import duties on the basis of the value of their exports. That was challenged because it was a contravention of the World Trade Organization's rules. And we converted that to the APDP in 2013. But essentially, the APDP, which is market agnostic, incentivizes firms through a rebate mechanism that is still tied to the reduction in import duties. And essentially, the APDPs continued the legacy of the MIDP, but in a WTO compliant manner. Ultimately, the South African automotive industry is export-oriented because it needs to be so in terms of the volumes that are required for the assembly plants, but also in relation to the economics of how the policy framework works. So vehicle assemblers in this country essentially need to export in order to be competitive, or they need to find export avenues for component exports so that those component exports can earn them the rebates that they can then use to discount the duties on the components they import, as well as the fully assembled vehicles they bring into the country. So the industry has gone through went through a major change in the mid-1990s. And as that program bedded down, the industry took on a much stronger export orientation around about the mid-2000s. And what we're seeing today is essentially the foundations that have been built, I think, over a sustained period of time, as Rene's outlined.
Thank you, Justin. So, Justin, there's a couple of questions that popped in while you were speaking. Eunice wants to know when the new policy for EVs will be out, and that's linked to the question from Shamal, which is about what we need to do to get a proper EV policy. Just to summarize those questions, any thoughts on that?
So the EV policy is in a state of limbo at the moment. The industry is still keenly waiting for the minister to provide clarity. There is an indication that there will be a notification of that policy either by the end of this year or early next year. But at the same time, these commitments have been made before and broken. So we're still waiting. It's a complicated issue, which we're struggling with because, of course, our market is dominated by internal combustion engine vehicles. And when we talk about new energy vehicles, we're actually talking about an array of technology, from soft to plug-in hybrids to battery electric vehicles. And then on the commercial vehicle side, we're also talking about hydrogen fuel cell, or also hydrogen engines as well. So these technology shifts, which are occurring very rapidly in the European Union particularly, but also in other parts of the developed world, are running well ahead of the developments we're seeing in some of the other markets in which we compete, particularly our own market, because obviously these vehicles are still not price competitive with us. They're not even close to being competitive with us yet without massive subsidies. And of course, the broader African market is still entirely dominated by internal combustion engine vehicles.
Oh, thank you, Justin. I hope that answers the question. Shannon's got a follow-up question. We'll get back to that quite soon later in the conversation. I would just want to now have a chat with Thandile and ask him, Thandile, as the Coca Development Corporation, how are these special economic zones, especially yours, helping enable the competitive manufacturing in the automotive sector? As Justin mentioned and Renee, we are export orientated, hence we need to have a price point that matches the global market. And I think if our listeners may not be aware of it, our viewers, that our local OEMs have to bid for a particular build against their counterparts across the world. So competitiveness is a key ingredient here. Thandile? Thandile?
Sorry, can you hear me now? I struggled to unmute. Apologies.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah. Look, I think from where we're sitting, I made a joke earlier on when we started that we're not aiming to be the hub. We are the hub. Okay. I think from where we're sitting, this is probably one of the most exciting events that will happen to South Africa, and especially in the Eastern Cape for us. Okay. Where you're sitting at Coga as a SEZ, where the infrastructure is already being installed, the bulk infrastructure. So, and we've got, some of you might know, we've got over 9,000 hectares of land. And in fact, we've dedicated 2 zones for automotive. So with those 2 zones, the bulk infrastructure is already installed. So when it comes to OEMs coming in or suppliers coming in, it's a plug and play. So access to market or access to production is much quicker in that way. 2, what we've got is we've got our big brothers next door, Transnet, be in the port of PE, be in the port of Ngoga, who are currently, as we speak, busy expanding the ports. So from a logistics point of view, getting to the ships, you're going to see in the next year or 2 that expansion going exponentially. Okay. Then number 3, we're sitting with a nice situation whereby our colleagues from AIDC are busy developing the rail line for the automotive and manganese specifically. Okay, so you then have this whole pot whereby the logistics problems of the automotive industry are currently being resolved and focused in the PE area. Okay, then the second one is we were probably the first SEZ to have what we call a one-stop shop, which is an initiative from the DTIC, whereby we've got internal capacity as an organization to advise and package submissions on behalf of the OEMs so that they can fully benefit on the various incentives that the government has got. And one thing that's a very pet project of mine currently is, some of you might know that we already got a supplier park in Utnek, in the Nelson Mandela Logistics Park, where we've got from tier 1 to tier 3 suppliers housed in one area supplying VW. Currently, there's talks, and we're busy in the planning phase of having a supplier park within the SEZ in Coga. So you kind of see, if you put all those 4 elements or 5 elements together, this is probably the opportune time that you've got as the Coga to say we're making our mark when it comes to the new transition in vehicles. Thanks.
Thank you, Thandile. I see Shamal's got a few more questions there. Shamal, the panel can correct me, but I can answer your first one. It's highly unlikely that South Africa will ban ICE vehicles anytime soon because of the reasons mentioned by Justin. It's like unaffordable at this point in time for us and our economy and for the rest of Africa. Secondly, the reason for us to now pivot to NEV manufacturing in South Africa is because of the bans in Europe. Although there have been some backtracking on that, where it's no longer only they're allowing for green fuel vehicles now, not complete ban on combustion engines. But hence we need policy certainty so we can pivot to make it attractive for manufacturing of NEV vehicles in South Africa to maintain the 400,000 jobs associated with the manufacturing sector in South Africa for automotive. But let's go and chat a bit about local automotive components manufacturers now, Renee. This global shift that I spoke about, if we don't move it, we will lose that market, right? How would this impact the export and demand for locally produced components? Because if the OEMs are not going to be incentivized to make electric vehicles, yeah. Renee?
Okay, so Vinesh, and I think there's been a few questions kind of circling back to this particular topic. I think there's definitely, from a components constituency, the most important thing is some level of certainty on the policy that supports introduction of these assembly lines in South Africa, but more importantly, I think some understanding of the OEM demand or production outlooks, as well as maybe how the country can be supported from, I suspect, some of the other industrial applications as we look to try and position the country for new energy vehicle components and technologies. So let's talk, for example, battery production. If you think about battery production, trying to peg it to a single OEM and a single OEM technology with the scale in South Africa is probably a bit of a long shot. But if you can find ways of combining some of the industrial and domestic storage capabilities, that's probably an interesting option. But I do want to introduce maybe some nuance to the discussion. Very often when we talk about components and whether there's a pivot needed or something along those lines, I want to start off with a statement that says component manufacturers in South Africa have been responding to technology changes when OEMs have new generations and facelifts for as long as that model has been in effect. We also have a supplier base that has over time been set up in a way that some of the main propulsion and transmission units, as it's referred to in the sector, the powertrain categorization. If you think about it, engine production, particularly in South Africa, is not at significant scale anymore as it may have been about 25, 30 years ago. So the kind of components that have been produced in South Africa with changes in specifications and probably combinations of subsystems will, to some extent, have some commonality with what we're talking about in the NEV context. It is true that there will be a categorization of components in the country, especially if you think about the darling of our export sector for so long has been the emissions control space or the catalytic converter producers. You can expect to some extent that that's a sector that's going to take a lot of heat, a lot of pain. It's already started happening. I mean, we can't shy away from the fact that there's already some company closures and plant closures that have been announced in the space. So I think, yes, there will be some structural changes in terms of what our base ends up looking like. But the advantage that we have is that, like I started off saying, component manufacturers, and this is a global, Justin would know this really well, it's a global phenomenon. Component manufacturers respond to OEM purchasing certainty and purchasing requirements. So as and when the OEM NEV platforms are announced, and we've already started making that transition. You were referring to, I think, the BMW investment, which included a level of plug-in hybrid. I think ESAM is already into hybrid production, same with Mercedes in East London. Component manufacturers have responded to that and are already taking up the challenge. Interestingly, there's some opportunity, and we're already starting to see. I've got a fairly big NARCAM member, which is supplying components into the highest volume pickup production in the US already, including their electric vehicle line. There's a materials beneficiator supplying into one of the best known EV vehicle assemblies in terms of some of the battery pack production. So it's already happening. Companies are responding to market needs in the export space as and when the policy environment unlocks some of the domestic EV assembly plants. I think there will be a level of transition that happens as it does with all models. I think we've also been involved in some research that has identified what could be based on the profile of the South African base, the materials availability, and the kind of production processes that already happen in the country. There's already some identification of localization opportunities, whether it's in the form of, for example, high voltage wiring harnesses, some of the redesigned thermal management systems. We did speak a bit about battery production. So yeah, I think there's opportunities, but to your point, there's also some sectors that are going to take some pain. I think the challenge for us as industry stakeholders and those of us that have a role, I suppose, in guiding policy developments and the like, is to see how it is. So if you think about the CATCON sector and the kind of companies or multinationals involved in the coating side of the CATCON sector could probably also be playing a role in terms of some of the hydrogen economy linked parts of electric vehicle production. So there's some opportunities, but again, to Justin's earlier point, and this we can't run away from. This is a sector that works on long-term planning, long-term certainty. So whatever that basket of proposals is, the quicker it's out of the table, the quicker the industry starts responding. And I think the components constituency is ready to respond accordingly.
Yeah, Rene, I think the summary is that it must make economic sense, right, for the OEMs to invest and transition to NEVs, and then the benefits will flow to us from there. And just while Rene mentioned a lot about policy, right? So from a AIDC perspective, maybe you can tell us a bit about how the country's master plan process is progressing to develop policies required to support the automotive industry's transition to the future mobility, which is obviously NEVs of all natures, two-wheelers, four-wheelers, etc. Any thoughts on that? And then there's a question I'll pose from Eunice to you after that around the Shwane SEZ as well.
Yes. Thanks a lot about that. As Justin said earlier on, government has been a bit slow. However, our sense is that the OEMs are making big decisions, and they're not waiting for government to lead on the policy side. I mean, we've seen, as you've said a couple of weeks ago, when BMW made an announcement on plug-in hybrid, that they made that commitment despite the lack of clarity in terms of policy. So I don't think industry is going to wait for government. I think we're going to go ahead. Industry is going to go ahead with other policy. However, there is increasing pressure. And yesterday I had a long discussion with the CEO of NAMSA about the efforts that they are entering into in terms of influencing policy and lobbying the DTIC to come up with a policy direction. But my sense, as I said, is that the industry will go ahead and lead anyway. What I think we should do, organizations such as the AIDC, is that this presents an opportunity for us. Tandile mentioned earlier on about that they've got plenty of land in terms of setting up a supply park. I think that lends itself perfectly in terms of attracting new suppliers that are NEV specific. Same thing with us in Roslyn. We literally 3 kilometers from BMW, 1.5 kilometers from Nissan. And as these big announcements are made, we are gearing ourselves up to actually accommodate some of these suppliers. So for me, I think the NEV space presents a fantastic opportunity for us to leverage on the infrastructure that's already there. The good thing is that, you know, South Africa, you know, there was some investments made. For example, with the IDC, it started in the early 2000s, where this unique supply park was built here in Roslyn to accommodate a number of suppliers. And so, and there's still plenty of space and land to be developed, similar to what Tandila was mentioning about Guha. So I think we are in a good space. We just need to engage with the OEMs. We just need to make sure that when these things happen, we are ready. And as Renee said earlier on, the cycles, we need to be in sync with the introduction of new models. And if you miss that opportunity, you know, we might miss an opportunity to attract new suppliers onto the market and to the value chain. However, as I mentioned earlier, you know, I think we already have good enough relationships with OEMs, and even the suppliers that there will be suppliers that are impacted, as Renee has said, but generally OEMs bring their own international suppliers into the country anyway. So I expect that OEMs will bring in NEV suppliers or NEV components manufacturers into South Africa with them, and we've got enough space to accommodate them and to an infrastructure to accommodate those suppliers.
Thank you, Andile. Maybe you just want to respond quickly to the question about the Shwane SEZ, if you are able to, from Eunice.
Sorry, what is the question?
He says, any insights on where we stand with the Shwane Automotive Special Economic Zone? It's from Eunice.
Any what, sorry?
Is any insight on where we stand with the Shwane Automotive Special Economic Zone?
Yes.
That's operating as far as I know, yeah.
Yes, so Shwane SEZ, Automotive SEZ, was actually born out of the AIDC. It started as a project actually in the AIDC Gauteng, and the idea there is similar to what we have here as an infrastructure that supports Nissan and BMW. They primarily support the production of Ford in Silverton, in Pretoria. I think it's become a big success story. It's growing in leaps and bounds. There's opportunity for them to actually grow as well, because Ford is growing quite aggressively. I mean, they moved for around 500 vehicles per day to about 700 vehicles per day. So Automotive SEZ is a really good success story in the automotive space, and it shows that with collaboration from government, both three tiers of government, which is DTI at national level, the Gauteng Economic Department, Development Department, and Tshwane, the city of Tshwane. This partnership, this tripartite partnership, has been able to show that if we work together as government, we can actually unlock some major opportunities in the automotive space.
Thank you, Andile. So Justin, before I ask you the next question, maybe let's look at the questions of Dinesh and Mudli regarding the plan to migrate value chains. And the second question from Tembakize Maduna about what investors are doing in the, actually, no, the Tembakize question I'll pose later to one of the other colleagues. But let me ask you a question about the energy vehicle roadmap in South Africa and how that can aid the shift to NEVs. Is any progress on this framework? And linked to that is, how does this roadmap seek to build the APDP2 you referred to for need revision on?
Okay, so I was going to take a step back. So South Africa faces real headwinds in relation to the transition to new energy vehicles, because our output is essentially very crudely, it's half directed to our domestic market and it's half directed to exports, of which over 70% of those exports are directed to the European market area. The European market area is rapidly shifting towards new energy vehicles. Our market isn't. We already struggle with scale economies. So what happens in the future when our vehicle assemblers are essentially confronting supply into a domestic market that cannot afford new energy vehicles and an export market that will only accept new energy vehicles? And there's the conundrum. On the policy side, the APDP in its existing form is a very good incentive structure for the production of new energy vehicles. The Automotive Investment Scheme, the production incentive, the automotive assembly allowance, all of these incentives are generous in relation to supporting us production, and they are equally generous in relation to supporting new energy vehicle production in the country. So when we think of these policy challenges, the real conundrum lies in the marketplace. South Africa has a challenge around our domestic market. I made the point in my opening comment that South Africa exports because the manufacturers need to earn rebates that then allow them to import product into the domestic market. The problem is that if the domestic market does not perform well, actually there's less of an incentive to export. Because without the rebate model, we're actually not a globally competitive export producer. We're too far from our export markets, and we're not yet productive enough. And we certainly don't have enough local content to cover the costs of the very expensive logistics legs into and out of South Africa. We only have 40% local content. So the key issue is, how do we stimulate demand for new energy vehicles in South Africa, one? Or two, how do we displace exports of our present vehicles into the developed world, into other markets that will still be consuming ICE vehicles? And of course, the obvious market then is sub-Saharan Africa as a primary opportunity. But it's important to recognize that we don't. I often have very dramatic discussions with people where they want to say, the industry's doomed. The industry is going to go through a difficult adjustment period. But remember, with 40% local content, and of that 40% local content, maybe 5% relates to the engine and the transmission system, and maybe another 5% relates to the transfer of that energy to the wheels. So maybe we've got 10% of that 40% under risk. The balance of the 30% is not under risk, because actually, what do we make in South Africa? We do the metal pressings, we do some of the forgings, we do the injection molding, we do the carpets, we do the trim, we do the glass. These are the same things that go into a battery electric vehicle or a hybrid vehicle. So the industry's challenge is not that it hits a cliff and suddenly falls off. The issue is, dynamically, are these shifts going to provide us with a growth momentum, or are they going to slow us down? And the reality is they've already slowed us down. Even our investment levels, the investment levels in the auto industry, when measured in dollars, has not increased. It's wonderful when you've got a depreciating currency. You say, well, I invested 200 million last year, and in 5 years, I'm going to invest 400 million. I've made a massive increase in my investment. No, you haven't. You've invested pretty much the same number of dollars into your business as you did before. And I can say this with confidence because we measure these things in dollar terms, and there's no increase in automotive investment in South Africa, and there hasn't been since 2007, 2008. So the industry has been struggling with headwinds for a while. It's been maneuvering through those, and the fact that we've got so much capital sunk in the ground, the fact that we've got such a good base capability that we've established over generations now, ensures that this industry is going to be producing vehicles into the future. The question is whether it produces those vehicles at the volume that we're presently producing, and whether we are going to be producing those volumes with the same, more or less local content. And these are non-trivial questions, because if we increase local content, increase volumes, well then, we can potentially massively increase employment and gross value added in the industry. The downside is that if we get it wrong, the industry potentially goes to sleep over a period of time. It just slowly dissipates, and it reduces its levels of activity. So for those of you who analyze these types of things, go and look at the recent investments they're not as fantastic as it looks. Many of the investments, if you go and analyze the volumes being produced, are actually downscaling. And the reason why they're downscaling is our domestic market no longer looks healthy at all. We have a model that we use to predict growth in the market. And our projection is that the South African automotive market will only be about 620,000 units by 2035. And the reason for that is the number of South African adults who can afford a motor car is no longer increasing and has not increased in 6 years. We've got 10 million adults who can afford a motor car in South Africa, and that figure is unchanged. And that figure is not going to change into the foreseeable future as we struggle economically. And this has consequences because firms export to earn rebates. If the market is stable or only growing slowly, then our export dynamism will disappear, and we will moderate exports to the level that is required in order to earn the rebates that allow us to balance the duty books into the domestic market. So the new energy vehicle challenge needs to be understood in that it's not an isolated issue. So things like the energy roadmap, it can all play a positive role. But for me, investments are one of three things. You're either investing in a market, you're investing in assets because you want to use it for global exports, or you're investing in resources. Investing in our market, not so healthy anymore. Investing in assets, yeah, we've got some good assets, but they tied to the domestic market. The key is, can we use the energy roadmap to trigger more rapid economic growth through the utilization of beneficiation and the growth of output of our minerals that feed into this energy value chain. The key, and Renee made the point earlier, the key is vehicle assembly. When you get enough vehicles being assembled in any location, magic happens because there's a technology multiplier, there's a spillover effect, and for every job you create in the assembly industry, you create 3 jobs in the component supply chain. And so what you really want to do is to make sure that you lock in vehicle assembly of whatever type that is, whether it's battery electric, ICE, or any other form of hybrid. The key is making sure that we've got greater volumes of vehicle assembly. And I'm not always sure whether these roadmaps and these other things are dealing with the central question. And the central question is South Africa a place that encourages large-scale vehicle assembly? Because that is the central point at which everything else follows. I'm giving you a long sort of half answer to that question, but the reason I'm emphasizing it is because sometimes we talk about these other issues, but the key issue actually, in my view, lies in our very poorly performing domestic market, which has no signs of recovering strongly into the future because of our declining, or rather our stagnant middle class.
Thank you, Justin. Yeah, and there's some scary stuff you spoke about there. But perhaps one point, maybe respond to Gabriel's question as well, regarding domestic stimulation, right? ICE vehicles are expensive, like you indicated. I think they're coming down now. I think 760,000 Rand is the cheapest one available, I saw recently. But still not cheap enough, right, for mass adoption. Any thoughts on policy regarding that, understanding our fiscus is under pressure as well?
The challenge is that a battery pack for any form of decent range, if we take not just the battery pack, but all of the associated sort of energy control systems, is a 250,000 Rand cost. So you still have to build the car around it. And then, of course, our vehicles are heavily taxed in South Africa through the ad valorem tax structure, which then penalizes those more expensive vehicles because the ad valorem has a gradient to it, which basically really penalizes vehicles that cost over 500,000 Rand. Which is exactly where battery electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles would typically, plug-in hybrids would typically sit. So the challenge that we've got is that these vehicles are expensive. And the market in South Africa is highly price elastic in the bottom 40% of the market, at around 2 to 1. So a 1% price increase means a 2% drop in volume. It's much more obviously stable at the top end. It's about 0.3, I think. So a 1% price increase, you've got a 0.3% drop in demand. And so we've got a real challenge, right? The South African auto industry needs volume. If we were to force a transition to new energy vehicles, the whole bottom end of the market would essentially not disappear, but it would contract massively because it's so price sensitive. The top end of the market would be reasonably resilient, actually, because people would moan and then they would adjust their buying anyway. But that would not be good for the industry, because if you look at our product range in South Africa for domestic consumption, we don't produce the ultra luxury vehicles. Even the luxury brands that do make in the country make essentially an entry level type product. Not that the X5 is entry level, sorry, the X3 is entry level, but it is a sort of an entry level on the SUV side. The C class is entry level for Mercedes Benz. I know there's an A class as well, but it's the lower price product. So even those vehicles would be quite affected because they're not yet in the top 20% of the pricing spectrum in the market. So we're in a very difficult position in relation to stimulating demand just because the vehicle's more expensive. Our calculations were that soft hybrids were 12% more expensive than the ICE equivalents. Plug-in hybrids are around 40% more expensive, and battery electric vehicles are 52% more expensive. And the gap's narrowing at about 3% a year, but it takes many years to completely narrow the BEV ICE gap.
Thank you, Justin. I now want to pull in our colleague Tandile into the conversation. So Tandile, before
Vinesh, I know you're going to pull Tandile in, but if you have a chance to circle back to this discussion, some of the points Justin made, I don't mind if we come back to it a bit later, please. I'd just like to add to something there, but you can go ahead with Tandile.
Okay, thanks, Renee. Yeah, Tandile, maybe look at Timokuzi's question, and related to what I want to ask you next is regarding what is the KUKA Development Corporation doing to help ensure that Eastern Cape, particularly Nelson Mandela Bay, remains the hub of the automotive manufacturing sector as we transition to NEVs.
Sure, thanks, Chair. I think the discussion, the way it's been going, it's very interesting. I just want to go 2 steps back, if you allow me, Chair. I'll answer this question because they relate to this question. Let's start with the Tshwane SEZ. Okay, I think my colleague from AIDC Uput Africa is underplaying the success of the Tshwane. Okay. Fortunately for us, we were involved in the Tshwane as an implementing agent. I mean, the feat that was what was achieved there, it's unheard of in South Africa. Let me give you an example. I mean, we spent, in terms of physical infrastructure on the ground, 4 billion rands in 18 months. Okay. The crux of the matter there was that Ford had a decision between locating in South Africa or elsewhere, okay? And then the crux of the matter, can South Africa Inc. deliver on these tight timeframes? And my colleague Put Africa is correct. It took a joint effect between Tshwane, Gauteng, and the Tazis to pull that thing together, okay? Currently, I kid you not, I'm in Pretoria now. I had a meeting this morning where they are talking phase 2. So we've done phase 1, phase 1A. Now they're talking phase 2, which is another for the first initial period. It's a 500 million rand investment, but they're looking at a 3 billion rand development in 5 years. So from a success point of view, that has been a resounding success for the country, and it shows confidence. I mean, if a company like Ford can have that much confidence in the country, and they are talking EVs also in terms of what they're building. So it shows that the market, I think the Prof coined it, that the market is not going to die. We might hit the slack, but I think to me and to the organization where I represent, to us, this is the most exciting part of the automotive space that we're in right now, okay? Then the second part I wanted to bring to the table is that, I'm thinking, if I was government, and yes, there's a lot of pressure at the government to announce all the incentives and policies around EVs. But the question they're sitting with now, and we need to be very honest with ourselves as a country, this whole thing revolves around incentives, okay? It's incentives. And South Africa is saying, APDP, yes, it's a fantastic scheme, but it's expensive to the fiscus. Okay, we did a calculation from our own benefit of an OEM we're trying to lock down in Kucha, and the amount of the value of the incentive runs in the billions. So you can imagine now, all of a sudden, you shift towards EVs, and the biggest cost fact driver of EVs is the battery. Okay. Now imagine now the incentive that the government must then put into there. So I can understand why this incentive policy adjustment is taking forever, because the guys are caught in between a rock and a hard place. Okay. Now the question then becomes, now what? All right. From where we're sitting from an organization point of view, we've seen a number of inquiries, okay, from guys doing the SUVs, the pickups. Now you must remember, yes, Europe has announced 2035 is a cutoff date for ICE engines. Okay, but there's some shift pushbacks every now and then, but that's what they've announced. Okay, but remember, Africa, the continent, is probably not going to hit those 2035 targets. They're still going to carry on long after that. I doubt where I'm sitting, where the Middle East is going to shift. Because remember, once you do that, you start affecting their oil business. So there's now, from a South African point of view, we need to then start framing our mind and saying, how do we then pivot, okay, and focus and replace the lost volumes with this new market? That's the first part we're thinking of. And we are I host almost on a fortnight basis inquiries of big OEMs. I can't mention now. Big OEMs say, we want to establish in Africa. Okay, so I'm saying it's high time for South Africa to say, okay, fine, there's a European market, it's a big market, we'll not lose sight of it, but how do we then shift our focus and pivot and look where the existing opportunities are? And to me, where I'm sitting, Africa and the Middle East is a big market that we need to target. Okay, so I don't share the doom and gloom that the market is going to die, and I agree with Prof. We might hit this low, but after that we're soon going to pick up. Okay, that's the second part I wanted to bring to the table. Then to answer the question in terms of how do we as Kucha ensure that we remain the hub? Okay, as I'm sitting now, there are 7 OEMs in the country. Okay, 7 OEMs, and 3 of them are in the Eastern Cape. Okay, now we are in that list, we are excluding FAW, we are excluding Bike. Okay, those 2 are in the Kucha SSZ. Okay, 2 hours ago, I was in serious negotiations with a big OEM, and Input Africa is correct. OEMs are not waiting for government; they're moving. Okay, yes, it's nice to have certain thing of policy, but OEMs, what we've seen from our side at least, is that OEMs are moving and are forging ahead in terms of what we're going to do. So now what can we do as a country? As a country, I think we've got all the pieces of the puzzles sorted out. I mentioned that Transnet, next door to us, is busy expanding the ports. Our container terminal is being expanded. Our car terminal has been expanded. Uput Africa AIDC, they're doing the rail line from Gauteng all the way to the Eastern Cape, to PE, okay, to export these vehicles. So now is the time, colleagues, not to lose focus. We've got the pieces of the puzzle. Now is how do you put this thing together? It might mean that we shift our mindset a bit and then look at how we diversify the market. To me, where I'm sitting right now, we're sitting in an opportunity to tap into the existing European market by changing a few things, and also exploring new markets in Africa and in the Middle East. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Tandile, for that positive message. I think, Renee, let's get back to you. And maybe as you bring up your points, think about what Dilly is asking there about the localization targets as well, and how we can probably tie these 2 together, the transition and the localization.
I think it's an opportune question, and it's probably going to tie into what I was going to add. I think Justin, to some extent, underplayed how important the discussion around market, and I'm going to just include what Tandile said, So we're not ignoring that the region is obviously a key potential market, and it's why we're doing so much of work to try and support industrialization there as well. But anyway, to come back to what I wanted to say, Justin made a point earlier, and those of us that have worked in policy spaces, the really important thing to understand is that the current APDP as it is technology neutral. So nothing stops any investment in any particular platform. And to kind of pick on with what my colleagues have said, OEMs are already starting to move to some extent because there's some level of sense in the policy framework.
Oh dear, I think we've lost Renee.
Yep.
Okay. Well, Renee is going to get connected again. Maybe, yeah, we can maybe just chat a bit about some of Abdul Karim's questions here about what the bigger picture is in collaboration across SEZs. Maybe our colleague Andile, AIDC, is doing collaborating with KUHA. Perhaps a question Abdul Karim asked, we like this concept of Africa Inc. Is there active collaboration across SEZs? Is there a point of contact to bring the overview concrete concepts and planning to the OEMs for 2030X?
I think definitely there's huge opportunities to collaborate. And as Tajila said, we are busy in discussions with Transnet, and both provincial governments are in discussions to revitalize the southern corridor from Tshwane to KUHA. In fact, as we all know, there are challenges. For example, most of the vehicles getting exported out of South Africa go through the Durban port, and we all know the challenges of the Durban port. Tandilo will I'm sure will agree with me that the port of KUHA is being underutilized actually, and actually has a great potential because it's a deep sea port. So I think there's a lot of collaboration opportunities. Another collaboration opportunity that we've looked at, and you know, as you may know, we have AIDC Gauteng with AIDC Eastern Cape. We've been discussing with them about, for example, the transformation of the industry, which we at Gauteng we've got a very well-established incubation program in the automotive space, whose aim is to introduce Black industrialists into the value chain. We are already in discussions in collaboration to look at setting up a similar incubation programs at the three OEMs that Tandile mentioned in the Eastern Cape. We're currently running two incubations with Ford and Nissan, and we've had some success stories of people graduating out of this incubation program. So there's a number of areas of collaboration in the space going forward.
Thank you, Andile. I think we still don't have Renee back, but maybe we can just chat about the question from Zama Zakir about, you know, the impact of batteries. You know, we know batteries are not necessarily a net zero. They're quite energy intensive to produce in the first place. Anybody want to have a go at answering that question?
Sorry, what is the question?
As we strive to reduce pollution and carbon emissions by transitioning to electric vehicles, there are concerns about the environmental impact of battery production due to the rise of consumption of raw materials. Sure. Can you shed some light on the automotive industry is addressing this? What is it doing to address this issue? What measures have been taken to mitigate the potential pollution and the resource-related challenges during battery manufacturing?
I'm happy to answer that question, or attempt to answer that question. I mean, there's two issues here. The worst technology for the environment is a battery electric vehicle using a coal-based power source. which is essentially South Africa. So unless one is sourcing the energy from a renewable source, it makes absolutely no logical sense to move towards the use of battery electric vehicles. So I think, first of all, we have to understand, where does the energy come from? A battery electric vehicle is potentially incredibly polluting if the electricity is dirty. If the electricity is clean, entirely different story. It is obviously then the cleaner source of mobility. But the battery itself is a problem. And I want to be very clear, I'm not against the transition to battery electric vehicles. As a matter of fact, I believe there should be very heavy subsidies and we need to desperately move towards them. The problem is they are expensive and they have a range of limitations that have yet to be effectively resolved. And that includes recycling the batteries themselves. So lithium batteries are problematic. They need to, their thermal characteristics make them quite difficult to manage. And they've got serious they've got serious challenges in terms of being recycled at the end of their use phase. So these are challenges that we need to deal with. I think what we're seeing in the automotive industry is a rapid shift that is almost forcing the science to catch up and creating an incentive for the science to catch up. But at the moment, I don't think the science is quite there. There are some serious warnings about the environmental consequences of these lithium batteries at the end of their use cycle and how we deal with them, which has not yet been effectively resolved. But yeah, it's very well put. I'm equally concerned. All of the work that we do suggests that it sounds like I'm knocking politicians, which I do like to do, but the European governments have essentially shot first and have started trying to work out some of the details afterwards. Actually, the transition that they're forcing, the technology base, right down to the amount of minerals available for the scaling up that they're going to force, but it's not even available. There's not enough capacity to produce the levels of volumes that would be required to go full NEV by 2035. So those are some of the real challenges.
Thank you, Justin. Yeah, I think definitely the minerals are an issue, and I think that's why alternative battery chemistries are going to be coming into the fore, as you say, driven by economics. Renee is back with us. Renee, maybe you complete your point, please. We lost you a minute or two into what you were saying. Have we lost Renee again? Oh dear. Okay.
No,
yeah.
He seems to be back, so let's see if we can
Renee,
connect.
are you unmute? Yeah, okay. That is good.
Colleagues, you please excuse me. Obviously, something has gone wonky with the stability of our signal here. So please excuse me. I've come off camera, and I'm really sorry that I dropped off for a couple of minutes there. Vinesh, you can please reintroduce me into the discussion where it was.
Yeah, Renee, yeah, you lost you about a minute into your last point. Maybe just want to take off from the point you wanted in response to what
Yeah,
Justin...
I think I was just building on the point that Justin made, that we don't need to get overly caught up on whether the current policy is going to support NEV production or not. It's already there. Our biggest policy tweak, and I wanted to state this categorically, has got to be some sort of support or movement on what happens on the demand side of the vehicle space in South Africa. I wanted to be even stronger than Justin and say the ad valorem is probably the quickest win opportunity we got to introduce some spark, and forgive the pun, but some spark into our domestic market when we talk about NEVs, and Justin explained it really well. I do think there's some scope for provincial support structures, governments, etc., to also be looking at the market stimulation requirements. It doesn't need to be big ticket, high spend items. Is it something that can be done at a metro level like we see in other countries around special rates and cost of licensing or whatever it may be, we need to start thinking creatively. How do you support the rollout of charging stations and the like? I think there's sufficient impetus in supply side support. I wanted to be even more direct than Justin and say that what is missing in the South African context is how to kind of reshape the market. And it's important from the way the incentive package works, not just from a can we sell vehicles perspective.
Thank you.
Vinesh, you were asking me about local content. I believe that localization is probably the reason why we all still have a level of government support into the sector. The benefits that come from increasing rates of localization is what we are all looking for, not only as industry stakeholders, but as citizens and taxpayers, because we know for a fact, and the OEMs understand this as well, the real kind of economic benefit comes in the value chain. So for me, this idea of should we have lower local content under an NEV context, it's absolute nonsense. We can't be supporting that kind of thing. There should not be fooling around with duty rates of imported components to make it more feasible here in South Africa. I believe if we're going to move in the NEV space, we need to start from the bottom up. We've already spoken about materials. Make the supplier base competitive from the bottom up. Let me leave this statement there. Thanks.
Renee, just to maybe build on that statement, how can the AITF possibly play a bigger role in that transition, right? Because they can play a dual role, the new technology adoption, but plus also transforming the industry.
Yeah, I think the AITF is a key kind of sector partner that's been set up specifically, like other policy mechanisms. It's to answer an objective of the SA Autos Master Plan. So there were certain commitments made around transformation and the development of a black-owned or a kind of cohort of black industrialists, and I think that movement is really going to happen. Let's call it at a tier 1 and lower introduction space. So the opportunities are going to be for funding around tier 2 emerging suppliers, and that's really important. We've already got the OEMs into the AITF. We need to kind of get as many multinationals into that kind of structure and unlock their own procurement baskets. I do think a structure like the AITF can play a forward-looking role in funding some of the technology licensing acquisitions. I mean, I can't speak for the organization myself, but I'm sitting here with a kind of stakeholder perspective, and I'd like to see funding move into some of those areas. I think we don't fully ventilate at times how important some of the foreign technology and license partnerships are going to be in this space, and I think it's going to get even stronger in the NEV environment. So I agree with the context or the question, Vinesh. The AITF can play a role. It's important that we develop more South African black-owned manufacturers. And I would go as far as to say that if we don't make those movements, if we don't get sufficient diversity in the ownership profile, I would ask myself in 10 years' time, how do you continue justifying the kind of incentive mechanisms if we haven't made those movements in diversifying? But it's got to be from a growth perspective. It's not about splitting the existing base. And that comes back to a point earlier made. Get the assembly numbers on board, let it respond to the kind of market opportunities. It creates scale, all of the good things start happening, including the development of black-owned industrialists.
Thank you, Renee. So, Tandile, a question has been asked by Trust regarding the topical issue, right, about the dumping of second-hand vehicles from more developed markets into Africa. We know recently one of the African countries has banned or put a minimum price threshold on the dumping of these second-hand vehicles. Any thoughts on how we deal with that in the context of the African Free Trade Agreement that's being negotiated, and perhaps creating a second-hand market for locally produced vehicles instead of these dumped vehicles coming from that were produced elsewhere in the world?
So thanks, Chair. I think from where we're sitting, at least from a KUHA point of view, we encourage local manufacturing. Okay, I mean, the investments that I'm talking about now is OEMs not importing, but OEMs establishing a base in South Africa. So right from the press shop all the way through final assembly. Okay. Yes, it's correct. There's a big risk on let's call it the ICE engines being dumped into South Africa so that we can access the African market. I think from a policy point of view, and from an importing duty point of view, I think the APDP's current format goes a long way in preventing that, because it becomes quite an expensive exercise. Okay. Now, there's two things that now one will need to shift. Obviously, now when Europe then starts blocking ICE engines, the prices of those vehicles are going to come completely down. Now, as a country, we must then make a decision. What do you do with the influx of these vehicles that are currently being dumped here? Okay, so that will need probably a broader discussion around the country in terms of what do we do with these dumped vehicles. Currently, where I'm sitting right now, I probably don't have the answer what the country's stance will be, but I know from where we are sitting, we are pushing aggressively so on local OEMs establishing a base here. And in fact, I mean, I'm a pathetic optimist. I mean, I'm sitting now, I'll probably say within the next 2 months, we'll have 8 OEMs in South Africa. Okay. And that would be very, very aggressive to say, if you're gonna be here, put your peg down on the ground and then establish here and create jobs. I mean, this one OEM we're talking to, we're looking at jobs of about 600 jobs that will be created. So from where we're sitting is that we are really, when we engage OEMs, we engage them to the sense that come set up here. And then we'll push for that. But then as the concept around how then the dynamics will shift in terms of when these vehicles come dirt cheap, the country needs to come to a decision on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Tandile. So Andile, there's a question from Natasha about, job creation, etc., right? In the context of this NEV transition, in your opinion, what skills are needed to support EV production locally?
Yes. So I mean, maybe let's start with assembly first. I think Renee mentioned it earlier that there's a lot of common components between ICE engine vehicles and NEVs. So the assembly skill to assemble a hybrid vehicle, it already exists. We've got the skill set in the current capacity. However, there are certain components that are unique, like the battery, like the high voltage harnesses, where we may need to upgrade the skill set. In fact, as the AIDC, we are in discussion with a German company called Automotive ABB, Automotive Berlin Brandenburg. And they are basically a sort of a NAMSA of Germany, if you like, and they've got collaboration with some of the universities and tertiary institutions in Germany, where they actually do training in the automotive space. So we're looking to collaborate with them to actually introduce training courses in our center, our automotive training center in Roslyn. So. That's on the assembly side, but both on the aftermarket support side, this also has to be done, and we need to do training to basically convert a mechanic from an ICE mechanic to an NEV mechanic, so to speak. So there's a lot of effort that we need to do now upfront to prepare ourselves for the eventual change in the market. But I think all speakers have said, and I think Prof has said it, that the local market is still a little bit far from actually a full-on uptake of the NEV vehicles. We're still going to live with ICE vehicles for a foreseeable future. However, I think our emphasis should be more on the assembly side because according to the LAMSA stats, last year we exported 63% of our production in South Africa. So a majority of our production actually is for export anyway. So it goes to say that then our emphasis must be on upskilling the assembly side of the value chain and not the aftermarket, because the aftermarket will come at a later stage. There's also a skills set that's required for the maintenance of the charging infrastructure. So that's another part of the skills training that we're looking at gearing ourselves up. We've been engaging with Mercita actually also to start to establish courses or qualifications that are unique to NEVs. There's also another thing I just wanted to mention that I think we have not spoken about today, is looking at other categories of vehicles. You know, the South African market has been very strong on the light commercial vehicle and passenger. But there's a big market in commercial vehicles, trucks, but there's also a very aggressively growing market in the three-wheeler and two-wheeler, so micro-mobility. And I think Tandile has said, you know, we need to be aggressive about attracting OEMs into our parks. One of the things, the areas that we're looking at to grow this market is to look at the two-wheeler and three-wheeler market, but also look at the commercial vehicle side, the truck side of the value chain. Thanks.
Thank you, Andile. I think we need to start wrapping up this discussion. We've gone over an hour now. So I think it's been such a fruitful discussion, panelists. Maybe I'll go around this virtual room quickly for some final thoughts, and we'll try and wrap up by 3:15. So let me start with Justin at the top of my screen. Justin, we haven't heard from you in the last few minutes. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I just, the South African automotive industry's opportunity, as I see it, lies in Africa. And it's about creating regional value chains. I made the point that South Africa has got 10 million adults that can afford a new motor car, and that figure is not going to increase based on our projection model. I've been working in Côte d'Ivoire over the last 6-7 months on their auto policy, and they've only got 1 million people that can afford a new motor car. But by 2035, they're going to have 3 million people that can afford a motor car, given the fact they're growing at 8% per year and are starting to develop a much larger middle class. How does one start connecting the ECOWAS region with the East African community area? You've got a large amount of consumption in countries like Egypt with a potential of up to 450,000 vehicles. Countries like Ethiopia also have major potential. And then South Africa as the real hub for the region. I think it's about strategizing an African automotive pact that will give us the biggest opportunity for growth and would also buttress this potential production challenge in relation to new energy vehicles, because then we would actually be facing major demand growth in both a traditional ICE space as well as major growth in the NEV space. And a combination that could be a huge advantage for us going forward.
Excellent. Thank you, Justin. Tandile, any final thoughts?
Look, I think the colleagues have, especially the last two speakers, have hit the nail in the head. I think coming back from Africa, from AIDC, you will notice, I know the colleagues in the first name basis, but from a KUHA point of view, we foster partnerships. I mean, we instill as partnership the AIDC and the likes. I think from a commercial side, we've got a very what's the word I'm looking for? We've got a very uncelebrated success story in the form of FAW around the trucks. I mean, not a lot of people know that FAW hits the 10,000 unit mark last year from just a few years of being in operation. That's a very big feat. So one will just have to look. There's a lot of sprouts of positivity coming out the market. And from where I'm sitting is, to me, the market is in good hands. I think the future is bright for South Africa. I think Prof has also hit the nail in the head in the sense that Africa and the Middle East is probably one of the new markets that the NEVs is presented in South Africa for us. And we need to focus on that. And lastly, for me, as a parting shot, I'm saying, colleagues, probably the NEVs for South Africa is probably presenting the greatest opportunity that we've had in a very long time. I mean, it's now we need to then readdress how and reshape how the automotive and especially South Africa positions itself when it comes to automotive industry. And I see the future being a balance between NEVs and ICE engines. And we're sitting right smack in the middle of that. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for that, such a positive message, Sandile. So can we go now to Andile, and we'll wrap up with Renee.
Yes, thanks very much, Chair. I think, for me, as we navigate this complex path towards EV, there is a topic that the automotive industry, both OEMs and components manufacturers, are really taking time and almost been resistant or reluctant to embark on, which is transformation. Just to give you a stats, in the park that we have in Roslyn, we have about 16 suppliers in the park. Only one of them is a black car. At Tazes that Tandile spoke so passionately about, where government put in a lot of money into the ground, and yet there's zero suppliers that are black in the Tazes Park. So, people are getting very impatient with the automotive space, with the OEM in particular, because all the OEMs are looking for is incentives and incentives and incentives, but they're not doing anything on the other way to actually justify the efforts that government is putting in. And taxpayers are going to get impatient eventually with the industry, because transformation is not taken seriously. If you talk to the CEO of AITF, he will tell you that they are grossly underspent. The money is there, but the money is not getting spent. That's my parting shot. Thank you.
Thank you, Andile. Renee?
I think both Andile and Tandile have to some extent touched on two very big objectives and kind of, I think the ethos of what NARCAM and its constituency is also trying to look and shape in our world, and that being localization and transformation. And I don't want to repeat, I absolutely support 100% the comments that have been made. To build on what Tandile also spoke about, maybe I'll close by saying opportunity has got to be the only way that we look at this NEV discussion. And I think to some extent we've spoken about today how to take the hype out of, is the cliff going to suddenly fall, or we're going to go over a cliff or whatever. It's not going to happen. There is transition that happens, and it happens whenever there's technology changes. I think I'd like to maybe close off by saying that opportunity is going to be unlocked when we start looking away from an incentive or policy support program that has always been top down. Throw everything at the OEMs and expect the filter down mechanism. There's already a structure that's doing that. Let's leave it, let it continue, but let's think materials, infrastructure build, unlocking or creating the kind of linkages with our partners on the African continent. If you think about the kind of rare metals, even the PGM group here in South Africa, that's going to be our competitive advantage. I've said it before, I'd like to see us as a sector start putting some thought. And it doesn't only need to be a government-driven thing. There's a role for that kind of beneficiation policy, but think about the kind of linkages that can happen between the auto sector and the mining sector. We're already seeing Anglo-Plat, for example, doing a lot of work in the FCEV space in terms of their own specialized vehicles that are used in the mine, etc. That may not be at the kind of volume that will drive things, but at least there's some working model that we can start replicating and getting into those discussions. So I think there's a space for policy advocacy. We do a lot of that. Justin's been involved in it for many years, but I do think there's some space for private sector partnerships as well. And I think if I listen to my colleagues, they all kind of we all champing at the bit to see this thing get moving. So thanks for having me, Vinesh, and the engineering media team. Look forward to further discussions. By the way, I mean, I think this is something difficult to close in an hour and a bit. I'm sure many of those on the call, I know most of my fellow panelists are going to be part of an event that we're having at the end of August, the NOCAM show in Swane. I think a lot of these discussions are going to be unpacked at a more granular, deeper level, and I look forward to seeing as many of the colleagues there. So thanks.
Thank you, Renee. Yeah, and thank you, fellow panelists, for such an engaging and positive discussion. Apologies to our audience. We can't, unfortunately, answer any more questions. We are out of time, but you're welcome to send us questions off to Shannon and the team, and we can try and see if we can answer them offline. But with that, Shannon, I can hand over to you to wrap up.
Thanks very much. As Thandile said earlier, this discussion really was very interesting. So thank you so much to everyone who contributed. And as Vinesh says, that does bring us to the end of our webinar. I'd like to say thank you to our facilitator, Vinesh Maharaj, for enabling an engaging and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you also to our panelists, Renee Mutilal from the National Association of Automotive Component and Allied Manufacturers, Andilia Africa from the Automotive Industry Development Center, Justin Barnes from the Toyota Vessels Institute for Manufacturing Studies, and Thandile Jack from Kuche Development Corporation. Thank you to our sponsors, the Automotive Industry Development Center, CHEP, Kuche Development Corporation, and Richards Bay Industrial Development Zone for their support in making this webinar possible. And finally, thank you to the attendees for taking the time to join us for this discussion on the automotive industry. We thank you so much for participating in our live Q&A, and we're sorry if the panel wasn't able to answer your specific question. As Vinesh said, we'll try and get back to you after the session. Our next webinar takes place on the 16th of August at 2 p.m. and will focus on women in business. The link to register for that event was shared in the chat. The recording of today's webinar will be sent to you in due course, and if you have any additional questions, please be in touch. You can reach us at shannon@creamermedia.co.za. Thank you so much for your time, and goodbye.